Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Sandra Oldendorf, for inviting me to speak today. And thanks to all of you here at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Bozeman for your attention. This morning, my aim is to share some thoughts, feelings, and questions in honor and in celebration of the life of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Thank you. This is a community of support here. I must admit that this at times feels like a daunting task to speak on the legacy of Dr. King. Dr. King's light and life shines brightly in my mind and heart, illuminating an example of dedication and commitment to struggles against injustice in the U.S. and in the world at large. While his example seems clear, the work against injustice continues, and it is rarely an easy path to follow, and to follow consistently. It is this context, the examples we have from Dr. King and many others, and how we can live our lives with those examples in mind and in our hearts. It's this context that I would like us to consider and reflect upon this morning. I frame this reflection through the question, what is the measure of our lives? Just to be clear, I think life in itself is worthy, and all of our lives on this planet are valuable. So I'm not trying to place our deeds, actions, and words against those of Dr. King or any other human for that matter. We are alive. We have a chance to live, and this in itself is enough. And yet, on days like these, days that we as human communities mark as opportunities to reflect on the birth, life, and death of those who exemplify certain ways of living, these days give us that chance to pause. Pause, think, and consider, what can we do? What can we do to honor those whose lives have mattered to us? Dr. King, yes, but also our other heroes and inspirations. How can we honor our family, our friends, our loved ones? How can we live what we yet have of life to incorporate these varying legacies of care, of love, of hopes, and of dreams? I initially borrowed this phrase, the measure of our lives, from the celebrated author Toni Morrison. Recently, someone created a book of wisdom using quotes culled from her writings, from the bluest eye to the beloved, to her essays and speeches. Morrison wrote in her Nobel Prize accepting speech, "Word work is sublime because it is generative. It makes meaning that secures our difference, our human difference, the way in which we are like no other life. That may be the meaning of life," she continued, "but we do language. That may be the measure of our lives. We do language, and that may be the measure of our lives." I'm going to ask that we sit with Morrison's words for the time being while we return to the words and work of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Dr. King had 5 books published in his lifetime, books that were often based on his sermons delivered as a pastor and his public speeches as a civil rights activist. One of these books was titled The Measure of a Man, and it incorporated 2 devotional speeches of his delivered at the First National Conference on Christian Education of the United Church of Christ, which took place at Purdue University in 1958. One of the speeches was titled, What is Man? And the other, The Dimensions of a Complete Life. These speeches, and much of Dr. King's life as a civil rights leader, emphasize his approach that meditation and action are indivisible functions of the religious life. The goal for Dr. King was, and I quote, "to think seriously in the presence of the Most High," end quote. This would be God in a Christian context, and to take action from this perspective and context. Dr. King had been inspired by Morehouse College president, Reverend Benjamin E. Mays, who in the 1940s prodded the Black church towards social action by criticizing its emphasis on the hereafter instead of the here and now. A young Martin Luther King Jr. took this message to heart. After graduating from Morehouse at age 19, King completed a Bachelor's of Divinity at Crozier Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania. It was here that he was first acquainted with the nonviolence philosophy and action of Mohandas Gandhi. He next pursued doctoral studies at Boston University, focusing on man's relationship to God, particularly in the works of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Wyman, on which his dissertation was written. It was also in Boston that he met his future wife, Coretta Scott King, who was studying music in the city. At one level, I hope we can recognize that Dr. King did language. He worked through the words of scholars, preachers, his mentors, his friends, and his family to then share his own words of wisdom and inspiration, initially in his work as a pastor and later as a civil rights leader. At another level, I'd like to emphasize that Dr. King not only did words, but also experienced a variety of ways of living that extended far beyond his Southern upbringing. He traveled to Connecticut the summer before starting college to work on a farm. He undertook divinity studies in Pennsylvania and doctoral studies in Boston, Massachusetts. These experiences also shaped his life in imagining possibilities different from the circumstances in which he was raised. Circumstances of intense racial segregation, discrimination, and violence that persisted throughout his lifetime, and for which he fought to dismantle, with the support, struggles, and cooperation of countless others. Later, in 1959, Dr. King and other members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference traveled to India to better understand the impact and work of Mohandas Gandhi and his concepts of peaceful noncompliance, or satyagraha. He also traveled to Africa and witnessed the struggles for liberation from European colonialism on that continent. These experiences helped to further shape Dr. King's belief that nonviolent resistance was the most potent weapon available to oppressed people in their struggle for freedom. They also galvanized his spirit in the struggles for freedom and dignity for African Americans and others in the U.S. Dr. King did words. He worked with words in his studies and his speeches. He also took his opportunities for study and travel and built on those words and experiences to shape his vision on what could be possible for all people in the U.S. and the world. And Dr. King took action, frequently in the form of directed nonviolent protests, to transform those ideas and visions into reality. We know from history that as a pastor in Montgomery, Alabama, he helped to organize a Montgomery bus boycott after Rosa Parks was arrested for violating that city's segregation laws. The boycott lasted for 382 days and eventually led to the Supreme Court decision to end segregation on buses. We may be familiar with his work, in conjunction with others, to end segregation at lunch counters and in hiring practices in Birmingham, Alabama, the circumstances that produced his now famous letter from Birmingham jail. We are often reminded of his contributions to organizing the March on Washington in August 1963, where some 200,000 people gathered peaceably and where he delivered his renowned "I Have a Dream" speech. These efforts, along with his discussions with various politicians and activists, led to the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. His actions and activism continued. Dr. King and other civil rights leaders organized demonstrations in Selma, Alabama, to dramatize the need for federal voting rights laws, particularly for African Americans. And while controversial in some ways, these demonstrations did lead to the eventual passing of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. It was during this time, in 1965 and afterwards, that Dr. King began to face some of his most demanding criticisms. He had faced failure before. Dr. King and colleagues were unsuccessful in their attempts to desegregate public parks and other facilities in Albany, Georgia in 1961 and 1962. Dr. King was also unsuccessful in his efforts to end racial discrimination in housing and in work in Chicago, Illinois in 1965. In the Chicago instance, and in many areas outside of the U.S. South in particular, the civil rights struggles of Dr. King and many others frequently fell short of achieving substantive change in the everyday lives of African Americans. Substantive change. That is, despite the laws that may have been created, the formal change that was declared, city officials and everyday living often thwarted the full realization of substantive changes. We may remember the rise of more radical and confrontational means for social change during this time. The work and words of Malcolm X and even Stokely Carmichael are often highlighted and contrasted with those of Dr. King. Historically, we have the return of many blacks from the war in Vietnam, frequently disheartened by their experiences abroad and further frustrated by the realities of continued discrimination and prejudice back home in cities throughout the U.S. Dr. King eventually broadened his concerns beyond racial issues to incorporate condemnation of the Vietnam War and a wider social justice program to fight against poverty and unemployment as well. It is in this context that Dr. King expanded his framework to fight against the triple evils, what he called poverty, racism, and militarism, all of which he considered as forms of violence that diminish our humanity in varying ways. It may be this expanded fight that led to Dr. King's eventual assassination on April 4th, 1968. Martin Luther King Jr. Day is a relatively unique holiday in the U.S. There are officially 10 federal holidays, only 3 of which are oriented toward single persons. The other 2 are Columbus Day, created in honor of Christopher Columbus and his maritime explorations to the Americas, and Washington Day, more commonly recognized as President's Day, created to honor George Washington for his leadership in the Revolutionary War and as the first U.S. president. Controversy surrounds each of these holidays for different reasons. Martin Luther King Jr. Day was proposed as a federal holiday in 1968. That would be prophetic. Just had to check to make sure you all were actually listening. I do lecture, so usually students are, half awake there. Anyway, 1968. 4 days after his assassination. It still took 11 years for it to come up for a vote on the floor of House of Representatives in 1979, where it fell 5 votes short of the required 2/3 majority to pass. The efforts of the King Center in Atlanta, Georgia, along with Coretta Scott King, celebrities and activists like Stevie Wonder, and a petition signed by 6 million people eventually inspired Tip O'Neill and other members of the House of Representatives to pass a bill to have a federal holiday honoring Dr. King in 1983. Despite contentious challenges, the bill eventually passed the Senate as well, and President Ronald Reagan signed the bill in November of 1983. The first federal holiday was celebrated in 1986. It still took until 2000 when the holiday was officially recognized by all 50 states of the U.S. When we look at Dr. King's life, it is no wonder that he has become an exemplar, a beacon, an icon, a representative of a life lived through excellence, with passion, with purpose, and dedicated toward social justice and peaceful coexistence. His leadership skills, his oratorical skills, his rhetorical skills are all aspects to be admired, to be emulated, and to be reflected upon. This, I argue, we do not doubt. It is in this state of reflection that we are here today. What can we take from Dr. King's life? What were the triumphs? What were some of the challenges? What can we build upon? I think we should remember that Dr. King did not struggle alone. He built upon the intellectual and activist legacies of many others. Clearly, we recognize his commitment to Christian values, the example of Jesus Christ. We can also appreciate his integration of the work of Gandhi, Dr. Benjamin E. Mays, the actions of people like Rosa Parks and the anti-colonial struggles in Africa, the love of his family and community, and even the criticism of other African American activists. We should recognize that Dr. King as focused as he was on racial discrimination and later other important issues of his time like poverty and the Vietnam War, did not develop an extensive program for gender inequality. He also sustained his Christian and contemporaneous perspective around issues of sexuality, and homosexuality in particular, at times suggesting that it was something to be discussed with psychological counseling. While these may have been limits in Dr. King's work during his short lifetime, these are areas that we can build upon during our lifetimes. Yes, there is still work to be done. In his sermon, part of the book, The Measure of a Man, in his sermon, The Dimension of a Complete Life, Dr. King built on the work of Phillips Brooks to suggest that our lives have three dimensions: length, breadth, and height. The length dimension is not the duration of our lives. Quote, "It is rather the push of a life forward to its own personal ends and ambitions. The breadth is the outward concern for the welfare of others. The height of life is the upward reach toward God." End quote. Our spiritual dispositions may incline us to reframe this last part, but the broader message is worth our continual reflection. How might we live what Dr. King considered a complete life? A life where we work to recognize our capabilities and ambitions and pursue them. A life where we not only pursue our ambitions for ourselves, but also consider how we can contribute to the lives, welfare, and well-being of those around us. And how to reflect not only on the material aspect of life, money, cars, computers, etc., but also on the moral and spiritual sustenance that a complete life can offer. For Dr. King, that moral and spiritual sustenance was oriented toward God. It was eventually framed in a perspective of acting with unconditional love toward all of those we encounter, our friends and family, but also our enemies. For Dr. King, without this orientation toward love, unconditional love, many of our dreams of equality will fall short, not in their ends, but also in their means. Our lives are often shorter than we imagine. We live day to day, even with our dreams and hope for the future. Our measures should not be the lives of others, however, but the pursuit of our own dreams and how we can achieve our goals with the welfare of others in mind, and with love, unconditional love in our hearts. This, I believe, is worth the work of reflection on what would be Dr. King's 94th birthday, and worth the work of, however we eventually, quote unquote, for those who look like you, for those who think like you, for those who speak like you, for those who may pray like you, but for everyone. Because in the end, while I believe that each of us individually gets to determine the measure of our lives, I hope that that measure is based on the love we have shared, the joys we have shared, and the struggles we have endured to work toward a more just and equal world. Thank you all for inviting me to speak here today and have the opportunity to reflect on the legacy of Dr. King. Good morning.